This is Polaris-Live. I'm your host, Sarwar Kashmeri, inviting our viewers from around the world to this series of global conversations on the US-China relationship. The program is brought to you in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association in New York. I'm really pleased to bring my guest to this program today, Professor Lynette Ong. She is with the University of Toronto, a political scientist, China expert, director of the China Initiative at Munk School of Global Affairs. She's written extensively about China's relations with the West, Chinese state power, contentious politics, and the political economy. Widely quoted in the media, including the BBC, CBC, Bloomberg, and numerous publications. It gives me great pleasure now to bring on and introduce you to Professor Lynette Ong.
Well,
Professor Ong, good morning.
Good morning to you, Sawa, and good morning to everyone out there. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you so much for making the time. China is a headline issue, and I don't even know whether you sleep 2 hours or 1 hour or stay awake and watch everything that's happening. How do you keep up with it?
It is not easy because things move very quickly. But I think if you have studied China long enough, have not been that long as you have, but I've been studying and going to China for about 20 years now, and there's a certain degree of predictability to it. So things might happen, but they also follow some sort of predictable pattern in a sense. So there's some comfort there.
Okay. Well, listen, here's where I would like to start. As you know, I divide my time between the US and here, and at least in the US, there now appears to be a consensus among the China elite, and that China has to be stopped. Can't allow China to grow. Is this reflected in Ottawa?
I would say no, because I think US-China relations has a very different characteristics compared to Canada-China relations. What characterize Sino-US relations is really one of competition. They see each other as a strategic competitor, whereas Canada doesn't really see China as a competitor. When the Trudeau government first came in about 7 years ago, he really wanted to work with China. But then, because of Munk's case in Vancouver, Madam Munk is the CFO of Huawei, the big Chinese technology giant. She was arrested in Vancouver several years ago, and then followed that was the arrest of the two Canadians by Beijing. And some people would call that hostage diplomacy. Then the relationship turned sour. So I think the relationship went from something that was two sides wanted to work with each other, but then China became some sort of a security threat, and a country, a very big giant out there, which the government wants to work with, but also has incompatible political system and incompatible political values compared to Canada.
A long time ago, I was having lunch with a very senior Canadian Foreign Ministry official in Ottawa. And he told me something I've never forgotten. He said, incoming officials in this department, he said, are told in international fora, you can debate as much as you want with the US and with others, but when it comes time to vote, Canada must always side with the US. Do you think that is still the policy?
I think that has been the guiding principle, because in terms of political values, strategic alliances, and history and geography naturally bind the two countries together.
Indeed.
But that principle and strategic consideration was put under enormous tests under President Trump. That people, especially people in the business community, whose interests have been hurt by souring of relationship with China, felt that the arrest of Madam Munk was done at the behest of the U.S. authorities, and then Canada get punished by it, and then but U.S. we did not have U.S. back when that happened.
Right.
So under President Trump, there was a lot of strain and people calling into question whether or not a strong alliance between U.S. and Canada should go unquestioned. But then, with election of President Biden, new administration coming in Washington, D.C., people pin a lot of hope on that things will return to normal.
How do you, excuse me, do you think that the phrase Cold War that some people are using is appropriate in this circumstance between America and China, but also the West and China?
I can see why people like to invoke the term Cold War, but I think this war between China and the West is also very different from the Cold War 30 years ago. Reason is, I think the Cold War was a lot simpler. It was an ideological divide. Like
Yes.
you draw a line on the sand, you can divide the world into East and West according to ideology. With China, it's so much more difficult to decouple, not only in terms of political values, but economically, system is intertwined. Everything that we wear, the software that we use to communicate, the computer, laptops, things are made in China. So it's not so easy to decouple or to, engage in a war with China, be it, Cold War or some sort of economic decoupling. So it's a lot more complicated than the Cold War, I feel.
Yes, and I mean, I reflect your views completely. There's a big businessman who told me once that even the trade we can't compare with the Soviet Union, because in the best year, American trade with the Soviet Union was what's done with China in one day. Mm-hmm. So it's a whole different aspect. But what I'm glad you brought up the two Canadian diplomats who I shudder to think. I mean, one of them has been there for 2 years, and it's so sad to think about that. And so I'm easing myself into this topic, Professor Ong, of Xinjiang, the Chinese, accusation that the Chinese are consigning Muslims, their Muslim minority population of Uyghurs, into concentration camps almost, and so on. And I noticed recently the Canadian Parliament passed a motion to declaring it to be a genocide, what China is doing. But the Prime Minister abstained. Can you explain to outsiders from Canada what that is all about?
Yes, I think the Prime Minister and his cabinet abstained from the vote. My reading is that they did not want to be involved in the controversy, and whether or not it's a genocide, I think it has a very specific and narrow legal definition to it. And I think a lot of people agree that there has been human rights abuses in Xinjiang. There has been a lot of evidence from various sources. Whether or not it constitutes a genocide, I think people hold differing views on that.
Yes.
So I don't have any insider information on what Prime Minister Trudeau is thinking, but my sense is either they did not agree with the narrow definition of the legal definition of genocide, or they did not want to get into that controversy.
And I imagine from what we talked a few minutes ago, he's got to be in such a difficult situation with those two diplomats almost imprisoned and trials being held without anybody being admitted and so on. But let me raise a question that I've been thinking about for a few days. I read a column by a Chinese American businessman out of Hong Kong, and he used to run and still runs investment money for some very rich American firms. And he said he used to go, in his column, he said that he used to go to Xinjiang twice a year so that he could check up on this investment, a couple of companies there. But he said from 2007, it became very difficult to go there because of the terrorism that was taking place in Xinjiang and in fact throughout Canada. And as I read this and thought about it, do you think there's any possibility that the conversation about Xinjiang, Uyghurs, Muslims might be one-sided, that we are not paying enough attention to what the Chinese are saying? You just talk about that?
That is a great question. There has been a number of terrorist attacks by Xinjiang Uyghurs in Kunming, knife attacks right after 9/11. My own sense of the events, and from what I have learned from the literature, so Xinjiang is something that I do not study in depth. So I read, writings by the experts. My own reading is that there has been some terrorist acts, but that has also been amplified and used as a justification for very harsh crackdown on Xinjiang. So yes, there was some sort of terrorist threat, but the extent of it doesn't really justify the harsh crackdown that we see in Xinjiang right now. So, just to be fair, give you a parallel. Right after 9/11, we see this drastic change in U.S. foreign policies to invade some parts of the world from the Middle East to Afghanistan. And then terrorism was then used as a justification for that sort of very aggressive foreign policy. And a lot of people would disagree with that too. That, yes, there's a terrorist threat, but does it justify the crackdown on normal citizens and cause so much casualties? I think that remains very controversial.
Yes. And so you're suggesting that, are you suggesting also that perhaps we ought to be a little bit careful about blanket condemnation, because other countries, when they're faced with this kind of terrorism or awful terrorism, as America was, behave in a manner that is not too dissimilar? Or am I just off base on that?
Yes, I think U.S. is a very prime example that it has, the Bush government has used terrorism as a justification to justify a harsh crackdown and very aggressive foreign policies, which foreign citizens have actually suffered as a result of that. So what I'm saying is that there are two sides of the coin. Was there terrorism? Yes, there was some terrorist threat, but then that was also blown out of proportion as a cover for very harsh policies that follow suit.
Right. Along the same lines, if we can just pursue this topic a little more, I've also wondered why I don't even need to use the word almost, I suppose, no Muslim country has supported the West in condemning China. I mean, you would think that the Muslim community in China would get all kinds of support. And I know there's no real answer to this that we can give, being far away. But do you have any thoughts on that as to why it might be?
So this is my understanding. I think some Muslim countries have come forward with a statement condemning the situation, or at least raise concern about the situation in Xinjiang, and whether or not that was in support of Western actions, that's a separate issue. But I think I'm aware of some Muslim countries that has actually come forward expressing concern about situation in Xinjiang, and they include countries such as Turkey, Indonesia, and Malaysia. But it also came only in the last 2 years or so rather late in the sequence of events.
Okay, well, that's really, really good to know. So I'm changing the topic. You're one of the authorities. You've thought and written a lot about authoritarianism and so on. And here's China, widely considered to be an authoritarian government. And the recent Harvard study pointed out, Professor Ong, that Chinese citizens view of their government is at an all-time high, it just keeps increasing. And of course, we living in the West always assume that you have this kind of control and this kind of oversight, surveillance, that one couldn't possibly be happy. So how does one reconcile those two? Almost over 90% in the last Harvard report, what Chinese people think of their government.
That is a very good question. And I think we have seen these sort of dynamics played out in Chinese politics, not for the first time, but over a prolonged period of time. First of all, you have a great firewall that seals off China from the rest of the world, or largely so.
Yeah.
There's some, middle class, highly educated people, business people who work with foreign companies that could use VPN, so they know what is going on outside the world. But that is also being cracked down. So people could get fined if they are found to be using VPN to bypass the Great Firewall. But by and large, you could see state and society being a three-layered entity in China. So you have central government, local government, and the society.
Mm-hmm.
So you would imagine something like, COVID, the outbreak of pandemic in Wuhan this time last year, where the government was hugely unpopular. There was an online uprising of pouring sympathy for the whistleblower doctor in Wuhan.
Right.
So what the central government has been able to do is to attribute the blame to the local government. So some Wuhan officials have been punished. They have been taken out of their positions, and then the blame is put on local government.
I see.
So in a way, central government then rescues itself, portrays itself as a savior that becomes more popular than before COVID, because bad things happened. Central government stepped in and punished the bad officials that get the blame, became the scapegoat, and it gained popularity among the people. But the central question is, why did the local officials behave in the way they did in the first place? And a lot of, I think, China scholars would agree that it is because of institutional pressure. They are not encouraged to report bad news, because that would encourage criticism, and they might get punished as a result.
Aha. Well, that's a really interesting thought. So you would not then be surprised that this study picked it up. And do you have any thoughts on how important or how reliable these studies are anyway, because of the authoritarian government?
Yeah, no. So I'm not at all surprised. So even in the imperial times, the central government is always seen as government with mandate from heaven. It is only because of mandate from heaven that imperial government has the mandate to rule the country. So there's a bit of a faith, albeit blind faith, if you like, of the citizenry in the central government. And that's very central and endemic within the Chinese political culture. So there's no public opinion poll in China. We don't actually know, but we have Asian some institutions, that is some polling that is running out of Taiwan, and the name has actually escaped my mind. But some foreigners have regularly conduct poll in China. And all the while, central government's legitimacy or popularity has stayed very high, around 80%. And local government has typically ranged from about, I would say, about 50 to about 60%. Sometimes it goes up and down, but there's always a gap between central and local government.
Fascinating. It's we have a question, Professor Ong, from one of the viewers, and they're asking, do you think the U.S. and China can drop the language of hot rhetoric, genocide, Cold War, and work together? And this parallels a Chinese professor who I talked to on Polaris-Live a couple of weeks ago, who said the one big suggestion he would make to the leaders of all the Western countries is stop using the word Cold War. So, so what do you think about this question? Do you think the U.S. and China can drop the language hot track Cold War so they can work together?
I think that would be challenging. I think there's, like we said at the very beginning of this conversation, there's a consensus among political elites in Washington D.C., even within Biden administration, that China is now widely perceived as a strategic competitor, a competitor that poses a threat to U.S. economic competitiveness, but also of U.S. political values that it espouses. I think from China's perspective, it is one of competition for sure. But secondly, my understanding of how the psychology of policymakers in China is that because the U.S. is losing competition on a lot of grounds, such as in high tech, it is coming up with a lot of aggressive policies and trying to rally its allies in order to contain China.
Right.
And that is what China is having trouble with. That you are actually losing competition. You are rallying your friends in order to contain me. And you are using these political values and democracy as a cover or excuse to do these things. I'm not saying that I take any position on these proposition. I'm just saying that I believe this is what Beijing policymakers are actually expressing.
So let me push you a little bit on this. I totally agree with you that the climate is such that doing what this person suggests, the viewer, is going to be almost impossible. But looking at it from outside that bubble, would you say it would be the right thing to do? Forget about how difficult it is to do. But wouldn't that help in the thaw?
Wouldn't that help with
for the relationship between the two?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, cooperation, as we know, always bring out a superior outcome than non-cooperation or competition. But whether or not that sort of best outcome scenario will actually come about in the short to medium term, I am not too optimistic.
Okay.
Not too optimistic.
Fair enough. So here's another thought for you that crossed my mind. It has to be a brilliant thought, because as soon as I woke up today, this thought crossed my mind. So, and it's this, that Canada is a little bit like Australia, right? Australia is on the other side of the world. Canada is here. Both are huge trading partners of China. There are other countries like Thailand, for example, and Cambodia, huge partners of China. So is there a way? I'm also thinking about the smaller, medium-sized countries who have to choose between China and the United States in many of these tussles. Is there a way that these countries could band together in a grouping of any kind so that they could support one another and have a larger weight than they would otherwise have?
Right. I think you're right that Australia, Canada face a similar kind of predicament as Australia on a number of issues, particularly vis-a-vis China, and on a number of things such as on 5G intelligence network, which is a network, a grouping of the United States, Canada, Australia, I think EU and the UK.
Right.
And these sort of groupings already. It's already, I think, an example of, people called like-minded countries coming together to counter China,
right,
in its, technological front. There are other instances, such as, the joint declaration signed about a couple of months ago, which Canada led the initiatives in rallying a bunch of countries in Central Asia and Western democracies to sign declaration against arbitrary detentions. It doesn't mention any countries that does the arbitrary detentions, but so that is another examples of countries coming together to counter China, or any sort of countries that behave, that misbehave on the internationally. So but there are also, I think, some strategic concerns of individual countries which would make them quite isolated.
Of course.
Like trade concerns. We talk about European Union, which is not a united entity, because different individual member countries have different degree of interest and stake in its trading agreement with China. So it will be difficult to get them into one collective mind and to take one collective action.
Let me pick another question from the stream that viewers are sending, Professor Ong. This person says, question for Professor Ong. Is there much evidence of any resistance to autocratic measures on mainland China? And they say, I refer to the work by V-Dem Institute, Anna Luhrmann, Stefan Lindberg. Any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, so if you include mainland China, if you include if China is defined broadly enough to include Hong Kong, there's of course a lot of dissent, as we have seen in a large-scale protests, some of them violent in the last 2 years. Within mainland China, outside Hong Kong, very, very little, because I think this is largely because of how powerful the Chinese state is. Before we see protest incidents, I'm not saying that there's no protest incidents. There's been a stream of protest incidents, and some would even argue that during Xi Jinping's years, the frequency has not actually declined. Okay. But the Chinese state is also very good at nibbing protests in the bud before they spill out to the street. By its power in the workplace, by where people live, the residents, the neighborhood. When the state agents on the ground smell that some sort of protest or social unrest is coming, they were able to nip it in the bud, like precluding people from taking their grievances out to the street. And that speaks to the power of the Chinese state. So that is, I think, which is why we have not seen the large-scale protests, even though the level of dissatisfaction going on in the country.
There is just so much that I would want to talk to you about, but as we run into the closing minutes of this, I want to ask you, if you found yourself alone with President Xi Jinping, and you found yourself alone with President Biden, right? What is the one thing you would ask them to do as a suggestion? And then after you answer that, I'm also going to include Prime Minister Trudeau, if you were alone. I just want something from you.
I would never imagine myself having the opportunities to meet with these leaders, especially President Xi. But if I had this opportunity, so let's start with President Biden. I would probably say to him that I think this is a defining moment in history, and I think moral leadership of the United States is actually more important than anything else, because people corral together. You can rally people together for short-term interests, but in the long run, and I think countering China and learning to live with China is a long-term business. It's not a short-term game. And I think to prolong, to have a sustained leadership in the long term, any country must have moral leadership. So a lot of that was actually lost during Trump presidency, and people look to Biden for moral leadership. And I would, if I had the chance to meet with him, I would actually urge him to take moral leadership. Think about it, fairly carefully and seriously. President Xi, it is tough. What I'm going to say, he probably knows it well. That it is. I think China is a country with a public opinion poll. You don't the government doesn't know exactly very well what the citizen is thinking. And by the time you know it, it may be a little bit too late, you know. So you always got to keep an eye on, you know, what the people do, and it's important to make people happy,
Yes.
and to have the mandate to govern.
And Prime Minister Trudeau.
You need to learn about two sides of China.
Okay.
That China is a multifaceted superpower, and is complicated. No one side actually portrays the picture accurately.
Well, Professor Ong, I think that President Xi, President Biden, and Prime Minister Trudeau would count themselves lucky to have you alone with them whispering something about the relationship that's going on, because it is, I think you will agree, the most consequential relationship, the US and China, in our age, certainly. But let me thank you. We've run out of time. You must promise to come back and talk to us again at some point. But I want to thank you so much for taking your valuable time to appear on Polaris-Live.
Thank you so much for having me.
And let me now thank our viewers. Thank you, all of you from around the world, listening to Polaris-Live. Please go to my website, kashmeri.com, where you will find a list of future guests, and also subscribe to the YouTube channel on Polaris so you can keep up with us. I want to thank you again for listening, viewing, and until next Tuesday then, goodbye.